The first thing you notice probably won't worry you much. Just another flaw in the wall, or maybe a bump in the plaster that you hadn't paid attention to before. It might even look like a shadow. If you're observant, you might see it move, but you might not. It's usually too late by the time you get scared. Your walls will be covered in them, little bumps like an old house. They move around like beetles, incredibly fast, writhing and skittering over each other. You may not think the exact word, but the concept will almost definitely occur to you. Infected. And it's not so far off, although colonized might be closer. The thing is, they exist in alternating generations. The first lives in your walls. When you see them, you're witnessing their death throes. They'll be gone soon. They die after reproducing. And one day you'll wake up and you just won't feel right. Not sick exactly, just off. Nervous and jittery. Like there's something crawling around under your skin. A few days later, you'll realize there is something crawling around under your skin. The doctors won't believe you, though. You'll get used to the word psychosomatic. You'll insist they're wrong, first politely, then urgently, then screaming in their faces as you feel yourself eaten alive. But they won't listen to you. Maybe at home, maybe at the hospital, you'll start to feel lethargic. When you try to move, you're slow and clumsy. A few hours later, you'll realize you aren't tired, you're paralyzed. You can try to get help, but there's really no point. They all release the neurotoxin at once. Even if you make it, whoever you call will never understand you. You should probably close your eyes at this point, while you still can, because then they're going to start burrowing out of your skin. He awoke to huge insect-like creatures looming over his bed and screamed his lungs out. They hastily left the room, and he stayed up all night, shaking and wondering if it had been a dream. The next morning there was a tap on the door. Gathering his courage, he opened it to see one of them gently place a plate filled with fried breakfast on the floor, then retreat to a safe distance. Bewildered, he accepted the gift. The creatures chittered excitedly. This happened every day for weeks. At first, he was worried that they were fattening him up, but after a particularly greasy breakfast left him clutching his chest from heartburn, they were replaced with fresh fruit. As well as cooking, they poured hot, steamy baths for him and even tucked him in when he went to bed. It was bizarre. One night he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by insects. He was sickened, but disposed of the remains as best he could. He knew they had just been protecting him. One morning, the creatures wouldn't let him leave his room. He lay down, confused but trusting, as they ushered him back into bed. Whatever their motives, they weren't going to hurt him. Hours later, a burning pain spread throughout his body. It felt like his stomach was filled with razor wire. The insects chittered as he spasmed and moaned. It was only when he felt a terrible squirming feeling beneath his skin that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him. They had been protecting their young. When I was a little girl, if you'd asked me what I wanted to be, a starving artist wouldn't have even been on the list. Most likely I would have told you a dinosaur or an astronaut. And later, when I realized that children couldn't become dinosaurs and brown girls from New Zealand couldn't become astronauts, I would have said a teacher or a nurse. At school, I got progressively worse at every subject but English and art. But in my teens, my auntie got me a part-time job as a cleaner at the local hospital. I thought at the time that the money wasn't too awful, and I was good at it. I enjoyed cleaning, even if sometimes what I was cleaning was explosive diarrhea or blood-laced vomit. After a while, I get used to most of the smells. Eventually, my minimum wage salary let me quit school and rent a tiny, grimy one-bedroom place in a block of concrete flats. When I wasn't working or sleeping, I made art to sell down at the markets on Saturday morning. And so I became a poor, part-time artist. There are certain staples every poor person needs in their cupboards. Potatoes and rice were mine. Both were dirt cheap and could be made into a variety of dishes. Growing up with equally poor parents and strictly enforced gender roles meant that Mom had taught me early on how to cook dishes that would stretch for several meals. Rice is great, she had said. You can have it sweet for breakfast, and you can have it plain for lunch and dinner. And cabbage. Everything seemed to have cabbage in it. But I still had my little luxuries in my tiny flat, a jar of peanut butter, some wild manuka honeycomb from my uncle up north, and a big jar of raw sugar for my cups of tea. You'll understand then why I was upset when ants started coming inside. They were really small things, some of the smallest ants I'd ever seen. When I got up in the morning, they would be swarmed around the tiniest crumb of dropped food, dividing it up and carrying it back to their nest in a steady brown-black pilgrimage of little bodies. I didn't begrudge them at first. I knew what it was like to be hungry, and I could appreciate more than most people could that they were cleaning up my mess and doing me a service. When they ate a hole clean through the paper of my spare bag of raw sugar, I decided I'd had enough. Borax and sugar, I discovered, was a good homemade ant killer. We had plenty of borax-based cleaning products at work for clearing drains and dissolving really stubborn filth, so I mixed up a solution as the internet instructed me, then left it in a saucer on the kitchen bench. It didn't take long for my tiny and welcome guests to find it. An hour later, a pair of ants ambled across the clean white formica and found the saucer. According to my research, they would feed on it, then carry it back to the nest, where others would join the chain until the poison had filled their home. All going well, they would be dead within a week, and I wouldn't have a bug problem anymore. So when one ant sucked the poison, then settled down at the edge of the saucer beside a companion, I wondered if I'd mixed it too strong and killed the ant outright. But continued observation showed it was still alive, grooming its antennae and legs, patiently waiting under the apparent supervision of its friend. Using the opportunity to study a rarely quiescent ant, I took up my sketchbook and started drawing them while I perched on the sole chair in my flat. By the time I was yawning and craving my bed, the two ants were still sitting patiently on the edge of the saucer. In the morning, when I emerged for a cup of tea after my shower, the saucer remained untouched. Only the body of the poisoned ant remaining, its little legs curled up against its body in a strangely fetal death pose. My attempt to poison the nest had failed. The next week, they ripped another hole in the sugar bag, which I placed inside a plastic bag and emptied half of the contents. Incensed, I hung the bag from a hook in the laundry room. The next morning, the empty bag lay forlornly on the floor, not a single grain of sugar remaining. Frustrated, I went out and bought some proper ant bait from the supermarket, along with another bag of sugar. When I got home, I placed the bait on the floor, and the sugar bag in a bowl, which was in turn placed in a larger bowl full of water. The family of sugar thieves was about to get their comeuppance. I slept fitfully, the bedroom door wide open, irrationally listening for sounds of my tiny intruders. Some part of me was convinced that they were conspiring against me. I had fragmented dreams of oversized ants crawling through my cupboards, chewing holes through glass and plastic, eating all the food that they could find. Eventually I got up, unable to sleep, and stumbled to the kitchen for a glass of water. As the light flickered on, I saw movement. The sugar bag had been removed from the bowl and lay sideways on the bench. The ants scattered madly across the counter, scurrying away at any crack or cranny they could find, their mouths no doubt full of my sugar. Thinking quickly, I grabbed a glass from the sink and placed it over top of one of the trailing ants who had just emerged from the nearly empty bag. I'd caught one of those little thieves. It was definitely watching me. Wherever I went, it positioned itself so it had a clear view of me through the glass. If I came close, if I looked at it, the ant would rear up on its legs and tap the glass with its one good antennae. The other one had been bent by the glass coming down on it. "I'm not letting you go," I told it. "Not until you stop thieving my sugar." Tap, tap, tap. I realized that it was much, much bigger than the ants that had first come into my house. This one was glossy and dark, as though freshly polished with boot black. The enlarged features lent its face anthropomorphic qualities that made me uncomfortable keeping it in the glass prison. "I could kill you, you know," I continued, "but I'm not going to. I'll make you a deal. I'll put a little bowl of clean sugar outside the front door at night, and you can eat that. Just leave my stuff alone." The ant stared at me through the glass. "Okay." Tap, tap, tap. With a sigh, I lifted the glass. The ant's good antennae wiggled furiously for a second, then it industriously trundled away and disappeared into the crack between the stove and the bench. Whether it had truly understood me, I don't know, but the outside feeding bowl was working. At night, the ants would crowd around the bowl, then chain-gang the entire contents back to their nest. As though satisfied with this arrangement, they left my kitchen alone. I laughed at the whole idea. It was like a tiny insectoid mafia racket. So long as I gave them their cut of the sugar on the regular, they left me alone. But even though I was happy with the whole deal, someone else wasn't. My neighbor, Charles. An older gentleman of European heritage, Charles didn't have much time for people like me. If I had my cheap portable stereo up too loud, he would hammer on my door with his walking stick until I turned it down. I couldn't even watch TV at a decent volume, so instead I just pirated movies on my crappy phone and I just watched with headphones in. The commotion outside definitely included the strident, petulant voice of Charles yelling about some piece of fat ants strewn around my threadbare doormat. "You stupid darky," he roared at me. "You bloody ignorant savage." "Evening, Charles." "What the hell are you doing feeding ants, you stupid woman?" "Keeps them out of the house," I started explaining, but he cut me off. "I'll tell the ruddy landlord about this. He'll have your guts for garters. You'll be evicted by the end of the week, you mark my words." "Good night, Charles," I said, smiling tightly and closing the door in his face. He ranted for a while after that, then fell silent, heading back to his flat. In the morning, all the bodies of the ants were gone, and a completely repaired sugar bowl sat neatly on my doormat. I didn't hear anything from the landlord nor from Charles. I didn't dare feeding the ants again for fear of causing more trouble. Almost 3 weeks after the incident, a lone fat ant wended its way across the kitchen bench and sat beside my cup of tea. With its one good antennae, it touched the surface of my cup. Tap, tap, tap. Then it ambled away, unconcernedly, and disappeared down the crack it had crawled from. That night I left a bowl of sugar outside, and in the morning there was a surprise for me. Sitting in the empty bowl was a beautiful creamy white pendant. I'd tried my hand at bone carving, but despite my artistic talents, I'd never been very good at it. Whoever had made this piece was a true artist. It was a flawless double spiral, covered in tiny, intricate etched whorls and patterns, like ones worn by my ancestors. And every morning after that, a new bone carving appeared, just as beautiful and cunningly crafted as the last. They sell well at the market, the pendants, well enough to keep my little friends in sugar for a lifetime. The police never found out what happened to Charles. They say that forensics could find nothing. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the old man had simply disappeared. The new neighbor turned up on Saturday, a sour-faced old woman. On the very first night, she bashed on the wall and yelled obscenities when I turned on my TV. I can't wait to take her to market.